Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am." He replied, then God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering one time of the mountains I will tell you about." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here." Isaac said, "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together.
Thank you so much, Steve, for reading God's precious word. Now, just before the message, let's turn to hymn number 3. If it's really hot out, you want to make sure you get toward that air conditioning vent. They're throughout the church there. I know that always helps me when I'm near there. So we're thankful that you're here today. We're in Hebrews chapter 11. And by the way, if you're using the Pew Bible, it's on page 1169. 1169, Hebrews 11. And I'm going to read verses 17 through 19 in preparation for our study today. We're studying this great chapter on faith. We all need greater faith and trust. We don't want to live our lives in fear. We want to live our lives in faith. In Hebrews 11, the title is Abraham, Faith Waiting. Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 19. Hebrews 11:17 says, "By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son." Those are interesting words, aren't they? Verse 17. Verse 18 says, "Of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called." Verse 19, concluding that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. We've been studying Hebrews chapter 11, and remember that the book of Hebrews is one of the most important books in the New Testament. It was written to Jewish Christians who were being persecuted, they were suffering, they were discouraged. You ever get discouraged? We all do sometimes, don't we? They were discouraged. They were almost ready to quit and give up, go back to Judaism. So the book of Hebrews was written to encourage them to press on, to keep on. Remember that in each of our studies in Hebrews 11, I've shared when we started the sermon that faith in God, only faith in God, will get us through the tough times. So if you ever go through hard times, it's good to know we can put our faith and trust not in ourselves or in people. They let us down sometimes, don't they? But we can put our faith and trust in God. So Hebrews 11 is the great faith chapter. And notice in Hebrews 11 we see 4 things. Good way to work your way through verses 8 through 19 is by looking at it in a question for each one of those parts of this passage. By faith, Abraham obeyed God when he did not know where. That's found in verses 8, 9, and 10. How, verses 11 and 12. when verses 13 through 16, or why verses 17 to 19. So we're going to continue as I preached this morning on faith, because so many people today live their lives in fear. We don't want to live in fear, we want to live in faith. And it's a privilege to be able to trust in God and His promises. Many times we go through hard times, and have you ever gone through a hard time? And I guess the first question we often ask ourselves is, why, Lord? Why? Why am I going through this hard time? Then usually the second question we ask ourselves is, why me? After you ask, why, Lord, then you say, why me? Why does it have to happen to me? Why am I going through this hard time? We want God to give us answers. But you know what? We won't always get answers to those questions, will we? Not before or not until we get to heaven. In fact, even there, we probably won't care anymore why we went through those hard times when we're in heaven. But it's important that we focus on the promises of God and not the explanations, because we won't always get an explanation about why we're going through a hard time. Now, this passage in Hebrews 11 is amazing, because remember that Abraham and Sarah waited 25 years. That's a long time, isn't it? To wait for God to answer their prayer for a son. God promised to provide a son, and Abraham was 75 years old, and then he was 100 when the son was finally born. 25 years he waited for that promised son, you see? And my wife and I, believe it or not, we're celebrating 25 years in November. Can you imagine? 25 years. I told her when we are on our 50th wedding anniversary, we got to go to Hawaii. I'll be 88 years old. So she puts me in a wheelchair. She's just shaking her head. Yeah. But anyway, 25 years. That's a long time to wait. Abraham. One of the things that characterized Abraham's faith was that he waited for God in faith to answer. And the question that verses 17, 18, and 19 answer is why. It would be natural, I suppose, for Abraham to ask why God would want him to offer his son of promise, Isaac, to the Lord as a sacrifice when God finally provided the son of promise, and now God was asking him to offer his son back to him. There's some things that we look at in our lives, and it seems like it's impossible, right? I mean, how could God ever work here? And we're going to study that this morning. It seemed like it was impossible how God could ever provide something or to be sacrificed in the place of Isaac. But you know, nothing is too hard for God. Do you know that today? Nothing at all is too hard for God. Jeremiah 32:27 says, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" And it's interesting that 10 verses before that, it answers the question. 10 verses before verse 27 and verse 17, it says nothing is too hard for the Lord. You see, in tremendous monumental faith, Abraham brought Isaac to the top of Mount Moriah, and he was ready to offer his only son, Isaac, the son he loved so much. He was ready to offer him to the Lord as a sacrifice. Why? I guess there's only one word. The reason is faith. Faith. He trusted God. He knew that God could raise his son from the dead if he did that. Abraham's whole life was a laboratory of faith, you might say. My wife works at the lab at Jefferson Hospital. But you know, all of us, if we're saved, if we know Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, then we're also in a laboratory of faith. God teaching us to believe. God teaching us to trust Him. Abraham faced a lot of tests in his life. And those of us who have been in school, do you remember those tests you had? Did you like those tests? Yeah. School would be great if you didn't have to have all those tests, right? I remember when I was in school, my daughter said I was kind of like a nerd because, whenever we had a test, I guess I kind of was, because whenever I had a test in college, I wanted complete quiet. So I would move my desk from the front row. I always sat in the front row. and I moved it all the way to the blackboard, so the teacher's chair was between me and the blackboard, when I took the test, I remember when I was in Bible college, one year, we were going to get ready to study for final exams. And they canceled the final exams. You know why? Because the whole student body came down with food poisoning, believe it or not. Many of them were in the hospital. And I remember many of my friends were in the hospital with food poisoning, even some of the teachers, and they canceled the final exams. They said, well, if you want to, after Christmas vacation, after the Christmas break, you can take the finals. We said, no thanks. They said, you can go with the grade you already have, or you can take the final exams. And my brother and I said, no, we'll just take the grade we have. We don't want to study. Who wants to study over Christmas break, right? They always get done finals before Christmas, right? In Queen College, right? Don't they do that? And so no way were we going to study over Christmas. But, life is full of tests, too. Not just school, but we have tests in our lives. And when I think about Abraham, he faced a number of tests. Warren Wiersbe shares 7 tests in addition to the greatest test of all, when he was God told him to sacrifice his son Isaac. But let me share with you those tests that he faced, because they all begin with the letter F. You should be able to remember some of them that way. First test that Abraham faced in his life was the family test. The family test. When he was 75, God spoke audibly out loud to Abraham and said, I want you to leave your home and go to a land that I'll show you. It was about 1,500 miles away, the promised land. So Abraham had to pack up, Abraham and Sarah had to pack up and leave their home. They had to leave their family. They had to leave their friends and their business. Would that be easy for you? Well, that's what Abraham did. He did it by faith. That's the first test. He passed that test. Then came the famine test. That's the second F. There was a famine in the land, and Abraham failed that test. See, he didn't pass every test that he took, that God sent him. He failed the famine test because instead of trusting God, he doubted God. And so he went down to Egypt for help instead of trusting God to provide. That was the famine test. He failed that one. Then was the fellowship test. The third test he faced was the fellowship test. You know what that test involved? That test actually involved his nephew Lot. Remember that Lot and Abraham had a lot of flocks and herds. And so instead of having an argument over where they were going to have their pasture land, Abraham told his young nephew Lot, you choose the land you want and I'll take whatever you don't choose. So he passed that fellowship test. Lot should have given Abraham, his uncle, the choice, but Abraham instead gave him the choice, so he passed that test. Number 4, the fourth test he faced was the fight test. That's the fourth F. Remember Lot when he was living in Sodom? Sodom was a very evil, sinful place to live. And remember that Lot was kidnapped. Lot and his family were kidnapped. And Abraham got his 318 servants together, and he defeated those kings that had kidnapped Lot. Now, Abraham could have said, well, Lot, you caused that trouble. You got yourself into that mess. You're on your own. But he didn't do that. He helped his nephew Lot. He rescued him. That was the fight test. The fifth test was the fortune test. The king of Sodom offered money to Abraham. He said, no thanks, keep it for yourself. God will take care of me. That was the fortune test. The sixth test was the fatherhood test. The sixth F, fatherhood. Remember Sarah? She got impatient with God. She had waited already a long time for God to provide the promised son Isaac. And so remember what she told Abraham to do? Take Hagar and have a child through Hagar. But what did Abraham do? He failed the test. Instead of trusting God, he did that. We always make a mess of our lives, don't we, when we do things our own way instead of God's way? And that's what he did. And then the seventh test he faced was the farewell test. When the time came to send Ishmael away, Abraham passed the farewell test, even though it must have been heartbreaking for him. He did it. He passed that test. You see, when you go through tests, we need to make sure we look up to God, because the tendency is to look inside. And when we look inside, we get depressed, don't we? Or when we look around at the problems we're going through, or we look around at our friends who, by the way, many times our friends aren't there for us, are they? They fail us. So he looked up to God because he knew when he was going through a test, he needed to look up to God. That's the key. Well, we see four things. If you turn over to Genesis 22, we're going to study Genesis 22 in the remaining time that we have today. And we'll complete our study next Sunday. Genesis 22, we see the test of Abraham's faith in verses 1, 2, and 3. Then we see the trial of his faith in 4 through 9. The triumph of his faith in 10 and 11. And then the testimony of his faith in 12 to 14. So 4 T's. You think you can remember those four? The test, the trial, the triumph, and the testimony. Let's look at the first one. Let's look at the test of Abraham's faith. And that's found in Genesis 22. And that is found in the Pew Bible on page 19. Page 19. Look at Genesis 22:1. Now it came to pass after these things. What things? After all those tests I mentioned in Abraham's life, that God, what's that next word? Tested. You see that? God tested Abraham. And he said to him, Abraham, he said, here I am. Then he said, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Verse 3, so Abraham, I circled these words, rose early in the morning, and he saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Here we see the test of Abraham's faith, the test. Dr. James Boyce, that's a test. Sounds like a test there. That's a test. All right. It's like when we watch the television and that beeping comes on. This is only a test. If you are hearing this, you're probably now dead. All right. Well, Dr. James Boyce said, God put Abraham to a great test. Now listen now. God put Abraham to a great test, probably the greatest test that any of God's servants have ever endured. It was a great test, wasn't it? In Genesis 22. And let's think about tests now, because there's a difference between a temptation and a test. Let me give you the difference. Satan tempts us, but God never tempts us. He tests our faith. Let me give you the difference. Satan lays traps for us. Have you noticed that? He'll lay a trap for us in our lives because he wants us to fail. See? He wants us to fail the test. He wants to bring out the worst in us. Have you noticed that? That's what Satan wants. That is what Satan does. He tempts us. He wants us to fail. He wants to bring out the worst in us. But God, on the other hand, listen, he tests our faith. Why? Because he wants us to pass the test. See? He wants to bring out the best in us. I like how Dr. David Jeremiah, that's the only person I heard say it like this. God not only wants to bring out the best in us, he wants to bring out the faith in us. I like that. That's what God wants, you see. So God wants to bring out the best or the faith in us. He wants us to pass the test. It's like the Air Force. If the Air Force tests their airplanes, do you think they want their airplanes to crash? Of course they don't. They want to make sure those airplanes will pass the test. It's the same way with God. God's going to give a test to Abraham. And as someone has said, our faith is not really tested until God asks us to bear what seems unbearable, to do what seems unreasonable, and to expect what seems impossible. That would describe exactly Abraham, wouldn't it? Now, let's think about the test that God sent to Abraham, because it involved his entire being. His intellect first, second, his emotion, and third, his will. But through it all, Abraham had faith and he believed God. Let's think about Abraham's intellect was tested. In Genesis 22, I already read verses 1, 2, and 3. His intellect was tested because God was asking Abraham to offer up his son as a sacrifice to God. Now that seems illogical, doesn't it? I mean, he waited 25 years for God to send his son to him. And now that God has sent his son, his only son, now God is asking him to offer his son up as a sacrifice. It doesn't seem logical, does it? So it was a test of his intellect, you see. And remember what God had told Abraham? God told Abraham, I'm going to give you as many descendants, look up in the sky, as the stars in the sky. Do you take time to look up at night? Do you look up at the stars? Sometimes, right? We're so busy, we don't even take the time to look up. That's the key to life, is looking up, by the way. Look up, and God told Abraham, you're going to have so many descendants, you won't even be able to count them all. And they'll be as numerous as the stars in the sky or as the sand at the seashore. Yeah, does anybody here like to go to the shore? Yeah, I don't like to go to the shore. I don't like the sun. I don't like the sand. I don't like to walk in the water and feel those whatever crabs or whatever they are that eat my feet. I mean, I don't like the shore. Other than that, I love the shore. What else is there? I like the boardwalk. I like the boardwalk. But God told Abraham, you're going to have as many descendants as the stars in the sky or as the sand on the seashore. And now God is saying to Abraham, your son of promise, I want you to offer him back to me. It doesn't seem logical. It was a test of his intellect. It was a test whether he would trust God. Now, if you look at this passage in verse, it mentions that that his son was a lad. Look at verse 5. Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, the lad. You see that? The word lad? Some translations might have boy. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, but we will come back to you. So how old was Isaac? That's a good question to ask, isn't it? Some people, when they read that verse, they think, and later on you'll see that word used again, they think Isaac was only a real little boy, maybe 6 or 8 years old, maybe. I think he was much older than that. Let me share with you why. Well, Ishmael, remember Abraham had a son through Hagar. He was called a lad, and he was 15 or 16 years old. Joseph in the Old Testament. Remember Joseph? Joseph, the coat of many colors. His brothers who hated him, remember, sold him into slavery. Joseph was called a lad even though he was 17 years old. So the word wasn't used just for little kids. And in this account, we're going to find out that Isaac's going to carry all that wood. He couldn't have carried all that wood for the sacrifice if he were just a little boy of 6 years old or 8. He had to be older. He was probably in his late teens. Some believe he might have been even in his 20s or even 30s. Isaac was, 37 when his mother Sarah died. So we know he was either between the age of, say, 17 and 37. Most Bible teachers think he was between maybe late teens and 20s. That's how old he was. Okay, so put it in perspective. That's how old Isaac was. Anybody here in their teens or 20s? That's long past for me. Okay, some of you are, yeah. I was there one time, but it was a long time ago. I'm 63 this year. I can't believe it. When I was, when I was a teenager, I thought 63 was real old, Now that I'm turning 63 this year, I don't think it's 40 was old. Really? 40? Oh, wow.
When you're in your 20s.
Yeah, when you're in your 20s, right. So Isaac was a teenager perhaps, maybe in his 20s. But it must have been, think about this now, it must have been incredibly difficult for Abraham, who was a parent, to offer his son the promised son. He waited 25 years. Think about this now, those of us who are parents. Think about how hard it would be for you to offer your child as a sacrifice to the Lord. See, it would be incredibly difficult to put the pieces of that puzzle together. I don't know if you like to put, does anybody here like to do puzzles? I know Russ and Dottie do, Paula, Lisa, okay. I know, let's see, Les Meese likes to do puzzles, he comes on Sunday nights. Some of those puzzles are so hard, especially when they're the same color, right? Or they're real little pieces, like, what are they, like 1,000 pieces, they're the hard ones, they're real small pieces, yeah. I couldn't do that, but anyway, Abraham's faith was tested. God gave this great test, probably the greatest test any of God's servants had to face. Because God said, Abraham, take your son, there was a command now, take your son, your only son, the one you love so much, and offer him back to me. Nowhere do we see that Abraham argued with God. He didn't complain. He didn't question God. He just trusted God. See? And that's why Abraham was included in Hebrews 11, because he trusted God and he obeyed. God made a promise and he obeyed. Now, think about this now. It says in Hebrews 11, which Joe read this morning, that Abraham knew that if he killed Isaac, that God would raise him from the dead. Now, when you think about what a miracle that would have been, because up to this point, no one had been raised from the dead in the Bible. Nobody. It wasn't like, a lot of people were raised from the dead. Abraham said, okay, well, God's done it before, he'll do it again. It hadn't happened yet. Do you know how many people were raised from the dead in the Bible? Do you know how many? Less than 10. Less than 10 in the whole Bible, this whole book of 31,000 verses plus, only 10 people were raised from the dead. You think of Elijah, he raised the widow of Zarephath's son from the dead, remember? Elisha, he raised the Shunammite woman's son from the dead. We have Jesus, who raised the widow of Nain's son, Jairus' daughter, and also Lazarus. He raised 3 people from the dead. And then, remember Peter, he raised Tabitha from the dead. Tabitha, also known as Dorcas. She had two names. And then the Apostle Paul. Remember Paul? He was preaching away. It was late at night. It was hot. And Eutychus fell out the window, remember? The Apostle Paul stopped his sermon, went out, and raised him from the dead and went on preaching. I guess I shouldn't feel bad if someone falls asleep on me. I mean, if someone falls asleep with the Apostle Paul preaching, I shouldn't feel bad if they fall asleep for me, But don't do that, especially if you're at a window that's high. Because I can't raise you from the dead. All right, so think about what a miracle it was now. Abraham, he was trusting God even though no one had been raised from the dead up to this point. He was trusting God to even raise his son from the dead. So that's faith. So first his intellect was involved. Second, his emotion. Look at verse 2, Genesis 22:2. Then he said, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you, what's that next word? Whom you love. You think about each one of those steps is harder than the one before it. Take your son. Those of us who are parents, think about that now. If God commanded you to take your son, your child. Second, take your only son. That's the only one you have. And then third, take the one that you love so much. That's why it was a test of his emotion, you see. Any parent would know how much of a test that would be. And sometimes you wonder maybe that Abraham loved Isaac so much that he didn't want to part with his son. Maybe God had slipped a little bit in his love. Maybe Isaac was above God. I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. But sometimes we worship the gifts that God gives us instead of God, don't we? Let me give you an example. There was a man in the Veterans Hospital. He had suffered a series of heart attacks. And this man had a young son. And during the time that he was in the hospital, this man, he made a little wooden truck for his son. Now, the boy came, he wasn't allowed inside the hospital to visit his father. So what happened is the boy was outside. Can you picture this now? The father's up on the 5th floor looking out the window, and the son is outside in the parking lot. And one of the people in the hospital goes out and gives this man's son this wooden truck that he made. Obviously the son was really thrilled. And so what does the son do? He hugs the person that gave him this wooden toy truck. And all the while, the father's up there at the window, knocking on the window and waving his arms. I made that truck. Like, don't hug him, I'm the one that gave it to you. Can you think about that now? And then that person that gave him the truck pointed up to the window. And he said, your daddy's the one that made that truck for you. And so you know what the boy said? He mouthed the words, thank you, Daddy. And the father had tears coming down his cheeks. See? Many times though, and when you think about that, we fall in love with the gift instead of the giver, don't we? God. In other words, let's say you need a job, and then God gives you a job. It's like my daughter, she got a nice job. And she says, everybody knows, not everybody knows how much she made.
Almost everybody.
Almost. All right. You know what though? She has a great job. Thank God he provided a great job for her, okay? And because I remember, maybe 6 months to a year ago when she was in Rowan, she was concerned. She was worried. I don't have a job lined up yet. And then lo and behold, they had a job fair and someone just calls her out of the clear blue. But when God gives you a job, don't forget to thank God for giving you the job, see? He's the one that gave it